In this time of pandemic, in literally our plague year, we light this candle because the light symbolizes both warmth and togetherness.
Good morning. I'm Reverend Joe. I want to welcome you to our service today, where we're going to talk about the events of 50 years ago that happened at Kent State and Jackson State Universities. We're going to talk about why 50 years later these events still matter. There'll be some great music. There'll be a chance to do some reading together, some singing together. So, welcome to church. Despite my private pain, born from what I failed to say, failed to do, failed to overcome, be still my inner self. Let me rise to you. Let me reach down into your pain and soothe you. I turn to you to renew my life. I turn into the world, the streets of the city, the worn tapestries of brokerage firms, crack dealers, private estates, personal things in the bag lady's cart, rage and pain in the faces that turn from me, afraid of their own inner worlds. This common world I love anew, as the lifeblood of generations who refuse to surrender their humanity in an inhumane world courses through my veins. From within this world, my despair is transformed to hope, as I begin anew the legacy of Karin.
My reflection this morning is a little known part of the May 4th story. Most people don't realize that there is a connection, a real connection, between May 4th and the history of workers in Ohio. The intersection of Kent State University anti-war students and workers began in early April of 1970, when militant rank-and-file truck drivers launched a wildcat strike aimed at both the Ohio Teamsters Union leadership, symbolized by William Presser, and also at the trunking companies. The wildcat strike began on April 1st after the National Freight Agreement expired at the end of March. Disappointed at the National Union's inability to get anywhere near the $3 per hour increase it had asked for, rank-and-file truck drivers who had walked off the job refused to go back to work. In Toledo, on April 10th of that year, more than 2,000 angry Teamsters shouted down Teamster leader William Presser when he demanded that 16,000 wildcat strikers in the Akron-Canton area go back to work. In defiance, more than 500 workers staged a march through downtown Cleveland in defiance of the union leadership. A freight company, Pacific Intermountain Express, attempted to move 2 convoys of 30 trucks each along I-480, but at the Richfield exit, 150 wildcat strikers threw rocks and broke the windows of some of the trucks. In southern Ohio, near Middletown, more than 400 steel haulers forced trucks to stop, with the truck drivers simply dropping the trailers, turning around, and driving home in their cabs. And thus it came about on April 29th, Governor James Rhodes, in a speech in which he referred to the striking blue-collar workers as hoodlums and criminals, dispatched 3,200 Ohio National Guardsmen to the Akron, Cleveland area to suppress the strike. However, when 50 armed Ohio State troopers and a number of guardsmen tried to break the blockade of a 3-truck convoy, the armed law enforcement officials were driven back by more than 200 striking workers, throwing bottles and cans and rocks. There is a cruel irony here. A Republican governor, Governor James Rhodes, who was the son of a coal miner, ordering some 3,200 Ohio National Guardsmen, mostly the sons of blue-collar workers, to suppress a strike by blue-collar workers who drive trucks for a living. And tragically, a few days later, these same armed working-class kids would open fire on Kent State University anti-war students, who are also the children of working-class parents. I am reminded of the classic labor anthem, Solidarity Forever. The words, "When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run." This reminds us of the power of the strike, the collective action of the many against the wealthy few. And yet, while a wildcat strike is forever linked to the tragedy of the Kent State shootings, we must also look from the past to the future by looking at another famous line from that same labor song. We shall build a new world from the ashes of the old. And we will return to this idea of building a bit later in our service. Thank you.
Good morning. So I had that very frustrating experience this week where you go to a website that you are sure you know the password to. You put it in and it comes up, incorrect password. I put it in like 3 or 4 more times. I was certain this was the right password. But after a while, I just gave up. And I went through that, lengthy and annoying process. You tell them you forgot your password. They send you this email. You click a link. You go to the thing. And then you finally go to that page and you're like, well, this is the password I thought it was, so that's what I'd like it to be. And so you put it in, and then it comes up on your screen. Your new password cannot be the same as your old password. And needless to say, you're just like, I just put that in like 4 times. You can't tell if you were making a typo. You can't tell what was going on. But this is just one of those moments where you are told that you actually remembered something while at the same time being told you forgot it. It's a little bit of a bizarre analogy, but it was ringing in my mind this week because I was thinking about another kind of forgetting that I was participating in this week. Because this week is the 50th anniversary of the Kent State shootings. And in preparing to talk about that today for this Sunday's worship, Mark Weber explained that we should also talk about the shootings that occurred in Jackson, Mississippi at the same time. And all I could say was, what shootings that took place in Jackson, Mississippi at the same time? When I finally, took his words and looked into it, I found a story that is reads like a script for how a certain kind of racism and a certain kind of forgetting happen in America, because this history was extremely straightforward. 10 days after Kent State, at a historically black university in Jackson, Mississippi, in the very town where Medgar Evers had been assassinated only 7 years before this shooting. In town, in other words, to put it into perspective, that was very used to civil activism and that kind of public action. 2 young black men, were slain, and 12 others were wounded when the protesting crowd that they were in was swarmed by 75 Mississippi police officers who started firing on the crowd when they insisted they had seen snipers who were shooting at the police in the crowd. The event, of course, was noted at the time, but was not really discussed. It was barely investigated. And its victims are mostly forgotten, because in a place like Northeast Ohio, the Kent State event is unprecedented. And for some reason, in a place like Jackson, Mississippi, the event was deemed kind of unremarkable. Now, I was born long after all of this happened, so this is all history to me. I'm the receiver of our storytelling when it comes to Kent State and the Vietnam War and the student protests. And even growing up very far from Northeast Ohio, the Kent State shootings were synonymous with the student protests of the period. I remember the pictures in my textbooks. I remember my American government teacher in high school describing what had happened there. But as I can come before you right now, even having done the research, there's only so much I can tell you about the Jackson State shootings. And I am both totally stunned and also completely unsurprised about how much we have intentionally forgotten about what happened in Jackson, Mississippi. And the contrast between that event and Kent State is really shocking. The Wikipedia article about the Kent State shooting describes every victim, and each victim has their own page. The Kent State article is probably 25,000 words. By contrast, the 1,000-word Wikipedia article about the Jackson State shootings leads you to one out-of-print book on the subject. I can only share the barest details about the Jackson State victims. Philip Lafayette Gibbs was a 21-year-old junior at the university. The other victim, James Earl Green, wasn't even yet in college. He was 17 years old, and they were both killed by shotguns fired by police. By contrast, the Kent State shootings have been discussed in more than a half dozen documentaries, maybe another half dozen TV shows and movies, along with scores of plays and poems. You see the list of songs and music that has been reflecting on the Kent State experience, and the names that show up are it's a history of American popular music. It's the Beach Boys, Bruce Springsteen, Dave Brubeck, the Isley Brothers, Genesis, among many others. The Kent State site was given an extraordinary exemption to become a National Historical Landmark. The Jackson State University shootings, by contrast, not only do not get celebrated in songs. The university named a plaza there in honor of Gibbs and Green, but there is no state or national memorial that stands to recognize what happened there. The simple fact is this: we have to start telling these stories together, because the meaning, the content, the significance of Kent State, both in 1970 and today, has something to do with the fact that killing students at a school is a kind of horror that reverberates through history and culture. And if we can't tell that story with its partner event that only happened 10 days later, then what we're saying is that the killing of black students in Mississippi somehow isn't as significant as what happened in Kent State. That we aren't really remembering Kent State so much as we are forgetting Jackson State. Then we're basically just ensuring that all we remember are white bodies and white schools. It's not enough that we remember the Kent State shootings. We have to remember this bigger story, and we have to remember it right. Because if we don't remember everything, we're going to continue to create a world in which white bodies are more precious than black ones, and where white schools are somehow more sacred or more special than black ones. We need to honor what happened 50 years ago, but not use the same blinders as the nation did 50 years ago. In other words, we need to do the hard, diligent work of learning and understanding and remembering.
I do not pray, but if I did, here's what I would say. Hear my prayer, O God, my fondest hopes and deepest longings, to hurt as few persons as possible, to resist the pestilences of fear, envy, bitterness, and hate, to come to terms with disappointment, failure, and defeat, to love with all my being, with my eyes, with my hands, with my heart, to love in every way I can, to accept the fact that all causes are lost causes, and that there are no victors under the heavens, to live graciously in a universe which at best is only benignly indifferent to us, to sometimes experience something other than myself, to never turn my back to the sun, to be free enough to celebrate another human being, to have faith enough to receive grace enough that I may sing, experience joy, say yes to life even as it destroys me. O God, be merciful to us and help us be merciful to ourselves.
Each week, we come together as a people. Together, we share stories, love, aspiration. We also share our bounty in ways that express our religious UU values. May this important ritual of sharing abundance remind us that making our world better is a task best shared.
When death comes, especially an early death, it is human nature for the grieving to ask the question of, why? Why did this happen? Why did my loved one die? This happens to us whether we are wealthy or struggling financially. This happens whether we are black, white, brown, or all of them. This happens no matter where you are born or where you make your life. When I started ministry, I first heard the phrase, grief is the great equalizer. 13 years after beginning seminary, this brief sentence continues to yield new meaning to me. I don't find why to be a very useful question when it comes to death. Natural? Absolutely. But useful? I don't know. When my own dad died 5 years ago this week, I asked that question even though I thought I knew better than to ask it. When someone we love, a person or a pet, dies, our system is often shocked by the end of a story. We have been in a relationship with this being. We had patterns and habits, and now all of that will change. True, we will always have the love we shared, but there will be no more new experiences together, no comforting rituals, no fresh insights. When someone we love dies, we lose the potential of their future. With the death of so many young people in the summer of 1970, this loss of potential came into an especially sharp focus, particularly those deaths at Kent State. It is a sad fact of our history and even our current living situation that young black men and women are in greater danger while living out their lives. And so a story like the one at Jackson State University, even though it is egregious and horrifying, is not as shocking. It didn't make the news in the same way the deaths at the students of Kent State did, because a place like Kent State is supposed to be safe. Unless they are soldiers, white young people are supposed to be safe. Soldiers at 18 are called men and women. Students at 18 are called college kids. The location of the shooting also plays a part. Young black men dying in Jackson, Mississippi, where no white man would be convicted of a crime by an all-white male jury, is an historic sin in our culture, but it's not really a surprise. Young white people being shot at, let alone killed, in Ohio while on a college campus, that was shocking. Whether the young people were black or white, our whole nation has lost the potential of what those lives could have contributed to our whole culture. Now, not every person who graduates college becomes a Nobel laureate, but every person touches life. In his novel, Fahrenheit 451, Unitarian Ray Bradbury wrote the following: "Everyone must leave something behind when he dies," my grandfather said. "A child, or a book, or a painting, or a house, or a wall built, or a pair of shoes made, or a garden planted. Something your hand touched some way so your soul has somewhere to go when you die. And when people look at that tree or flower you planted, you're there. It doesn't matter what you do," he said, "as long as you change something from the way it was before you touched it into something that's like you after you take your hands away. The difference between the man who just cuts the lawn and a real gardener is the touching," he said. "The lawn cutter might just as well not have been there at all. The gardener will be there for a lifetime." At the end, I suppose more aptly, every life, when it is done, leaves some seeds unplanted. We just often imagine that a young life cut short leaves more seeds, more plants unrealized. We can't help ourselves but ask the question, what might have become of their life if they had lived? This is the question we ask ourselves every time a life is cut short by violence, either in our streets or in our schools. What might have is as an unanswerable a question as is why. We commemorate these shootings from 50 years ago. As we do, let us consider that loss of potential, all the while knowing that what Ray Bradbury wrote is true. It doesn't matter what you do so long as something has changed from the way it was before you touched it. It is my fervent hope that by focusing our service today on the tragic loss of these young people 50 years ago, we will stir within us anew the righteous passion for social justice that lies sometimes dormant within us.
In the ritual traditions of both Judaism and Christianity, the tradition of reading out names, especially the names of those who have passed, signifies a unique kind of scriptural moment. a moment where wisdom gives way to remembrance, where we intentionally and as a community do our best to, by reciting the names of those who have passed, confirm them to our memories. In the anniversary year of 50 years since two tragic shootings shaped the discourse of American thinking about war and violence and our participation in global atrocities, it's appropriate that we consider those names and read them into our own reflection and remembrance as a kind of scripture. And with that in mind, we note that on May 4th, 1970, Ohio National Guardsmen opened fire on a group of students at Kent State University who were there protesting the Vietnam War. 4 students were killed and 9 were wounded. A little more than 10 days later, in the evening of May 15th, Mississippi State Police and Jackson City Police in Mississippi fired onto a group of students who were protesting because of the rumored death of Charles Evers on the campus of Jackson State University. 2 young men were killed and 12 were injured. We remember the students killed at Kent State: Allison Krause, Jeffrey Miller, William Schroeder, and Sandra Schuer. We also remember the young men who were killed at Jackson State University: Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green. By our remembering these 2 tragic shootings, almost exactly a half-century ago, we recommit ourselves to building a world where this kind of violence no longer happens.
My second reflection this morning is the solidarity economy, a new normal? In the period 1977 to 1981, the Mahoning Valley of Ohio, Youngstown, lost every one of its steel mills. They all closed. The steelmakers told the Steelworkers Union that it was cheaper to close the plants and lay off the workers than it was to modernize these plants. Efforts by laid-off workers, local unions, and the Youngstown area Catholic diocese were not successful in getting federal loan guarantees of $20 million so that a community-owned steel mill could be created and outfitted to employ at least some of the laid-off steelworkers. It seems to me as though the laid-off workers and their allies were taking to heart another line from the labor song Solidarity. And that line says, "Together we'll build a new world from the ashes of the old." At a recent reunion of the veterans of the Youngstown struggles to create a community-owned steel mill, activist at the time, Rich Feldman, said that the labor movement has always been about workers making a living. But now, he continued, it must also help workers make a life. What does this mean? I'd like to think that the communitarian values of the students of the 60s and the students at Kent State, that these values can find a new life in the post-coronavirus world we hope we will soon enter. The United States has some 30 million small businesses, most of which have been forced to close by the pandemic, which has killed more than 60,000 Americans. Well, how many of these small enterprises will reopen? Economists do not agree, but several have suggested that more than half of the 30 million small businesses will not reopen. Well, what will the former owners and the former workers in these small businesses, what will they do? One idea, post-coronavirus idea, is to transform our market economy into a kind of solidarity economy with government support for the creation of local cooperatives, employee-owned businesses, and small-scale farms that offer locally grown produce and meat. We want a new economy growing from the ashes of the old. We want an economy that focuses upon socially useful work, which will help us all to make not just a living, but a life. Thank you.
Sound of one who makes a choice.
Today our service focused on loss and the world that we hope to make happen. Let the words of Mark Weber, Ray Bradbury, Alan Georgia, and myself inspire you to, as best you can, often as you can, and consistently as you can, make the world a better place. Remember, the things and the people you touch, you resonate with them, you leave something with them. Make it best.
Praise